Thank you for staying with us. A recent report by the World Bank says that the COVID-19 pandemic is estimated to push an additional 88 million to 115 million people into extreme poverty this year, with the total rising to as many as 150 million in 2021, which depends on economic contraction. Hello.
That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people.
Well, to help us understand exactly what is happening and how to eradicate poverty, we have Olumide Ojo, Program Manager, Resilient of Private Sector Engagement, Oxfam, Nigeria, that should be joining us. But we have Sheila Nkunika, Senior Social Protection Specialist, Save the Children International, Nigeria. Hello, Sheila. Thank you for joining us. Sheila, if you can hear me, these numbers put forward by the World Bank, 88 million to 115 million people being pushed into extreme poverty, and this is likely to go up to 150 million by 2021. Those numbers are scary. Do you agree?
Hello, sorry, I didn't get that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please.
Okay, so I was talking about the numbers put forward by the World Bank, 88 million to 115 being pushed into extreme poverty, and that might grow up to 150 by 2021. Those numbers are scary. Even within our own space, for instance, where there was that figure put out there about 80 million Nigerians live below the poverty line. We're talking about extreme poverty here.
Yes, so what we see with these trends is that the poverty, for instance, in Nigeria is already high. So what COVID-19 did, COVID-19 was like a very significant shock to those households. So those households, 80 million plus for Nigeria, were already living in poverty. What it means is that when COVID-19 struck, it really broke down that system of making income for the household. So you find a lot of these households are dependent on daily income. A lot of them were negatively affected by the lockdown. So what the lockdown meant was that these people would not go out anymore to go and make ends meet. But even beyond that, there were a lot of other effects. So for children, for instance, were affected because there was a heightened malnutrition level in the households. Even those that we don't consider extremely poor, especially in urban areas because they are into petty businesses, into some form of trading, became very poor. So actually, these figures are really real. And for Nigeria, they're very real. So this year alone, the World Bank estimates that 5 million people in Nigeria itself, before the end of the year, will go into poverty. So these figures really speak to a current situation that is on the ground. And I think this situation really needs to be addressed in various ways. So one of the critical things that can be done is to strengthen social protection systems. These are systems that have been proven across the world to really address issues of poverty and vulnerability, and just to support households' engagement into economic activity, to cushion them, to prevent them from taking negative coping mechanisms, and just to help them to cope with such shocks. So speaking to those figures, yes, the World Bank is right. That is actually what is happening on ground. And as we go ahead, unless measures are taken or systems are put in place to protect these people, we expect to see an enormous jump in the number of people that are living below the poverty line.
Sheila, let me ask you something pretty basic. How is poverty measured? At what point is one considered impoverished?
Okay, so that is a very interesting question. So globally, they consider poverty as anybody who's living below $1.9 a day, okay? So strangely, when we come to Nigeria, though, we have adopted a national definition of poverty. So what you find, according to the recent Living Standard Survey, is that anybody who's living below 137,450,000 naira a year is considered poor. This, when you divide it by every day, it's about 367 naira per day, which is basically $1. So When you look at the Nigerian calculation of poverty, it actually looks at $1 per day. When you look at the global calculation of poverty, this talks about $1.9 a day. So there is that variation. But in any case, countries determine on their own their poverty line. So the poverty line here in Nigeria is determined by basic food. So how much money as a person do I require every day to have my basic calorie intake? Apart from that, what are other services or other things that I should access in that day? So that is that calculation. So in Nigeria itself, a person is considered poor if they do not have 137,450,000 naira per year. And that is basically just 387 naira per day. So that is the definition of poverty here in Nigeria. Though, when we talk about poverty, people like to think about it in monetary terms. But this goes beyond the monetary discussion of poverty. We need to look at the multidimensional. So when we talk about multidimensional, what are those other issues that result into a household being considered poor? So for instance, access to education, access to health, maternal mortality, access to water, child mortality. So in Nigeria, for instance, we now have the largest number of stunted children, okay? So this number of stunted children basically means that these children did not get enough nutrition, they did not get enough water and sanitation from the time their parents were pregnant to the time they were born. This is entirely not a new thing. It's not very, most people would not worry about it. But what it means is that in the next 20 years, as those children grow up, they become less productive. So when we talk about poverty, you can think about it in monetary terms, but it's important also to know that it goes beyond the money factor. And here we're talking about multidimensional poverty, access to a lot of other social services, participation. So there are a lot of different dimensions of poverty.
You know, Sheila, this it's a good thing that we're looking at spreading the net, not just looking at the monetary side of it. Because if you want to look at the monetary side, 367 naira per day can hardly buy a loaf of bread for a family. I mean, in the current situation we find ourselves, 450, depending on where you live or what kind of bread you want to eat. But Sheila, if we look at this, the broad picture you painted about the different sides of it, the social amenities of life, education, health, if you look at all of that, how do we begin to talk about eradicating poverty? Where do we begin?
So I had this very interesting discussion a few weeks ago with some colleagues. So we discussed the question to say, if somebody came to ask you, the president asked you today to say, what is the one thing that I should do to address the high levels of poverty in Nigeria? The point was that there were a lot of diverse answers. So some people said, okay, well, if you just took everybody to school, if you gave everybody enough food, okay, if we had free access to education, if we did industrialization. There were even answers around if we need prayers, okay? So what's the one thing that you need to get out of poverty? The answer was prayer. So we understand that poverty basically is not there's no one solution to eradicating poverty. It's about different strategies that need to work together. So one of these strategies is social protection, okay? So social protection across different countries has been shown to really address issues of poverty. So the reason why social protection is very vital is because it targets directly the poor and the vulnerable. There are a lot of programs. So for Nigeria, as for the rest of Africa and the rest of the world, in the last 20 years or so, economies have been growing. But despite this economic growth, we have not seen corresponding reductions in poverty. So this makes you to understand that even if our economies grow, even if we have more money in these economies, this money is not spread evenly to everyone. Not everybody benefits from these resources. So that's why you need to put in social protection. Now, social protection, as is defined by the Nigerian Social Protection Policy, is basically measures and programs that are put in place by governments to address shocks, poverty, vulnerability, and risks. The importance of social protection is, apart from just other programs, which are broad social policy. So education is a broad social policy. Health is a broad social policy. When you talk about social protection, it really targets those people that are the poorest. The government here in Nigeria has been strengthening the social protection system. We now have a policy that is being reviewed. there's the National Social Investment Program, and under that, the National Social Safety Net Program. But what we need to understand is that there are a lot of challenges around those programs. So there's a lot of fragmentation. At the end of the day, no one solution can deal with the poverty that is on ground. So there's a lot of fragmentation, there's issues of coverage, so a lot of people are not covered by these mechanisms. I'll give you one interesting example that comes up to me. So when people talk about China, usually everybody thinks about the fantastic economic growth that happened there. But what they do not talk about is behind that economic growth, the government of China took measures, basically, put these measures in place to ensure that that economic growth results in poverty reduction. So before, as in 1981, China had about almost 750 million people living in poverty. That was like almost, at the time, 8% of their population. Coming down now to about 2013, most recently, they have managed to reduce that number to 1.8% of their population living in poverty. Imagine just the 1.8%. And most of these are in rural areas. So they've lifted basically about 750 million people out of poverty over a space of, let's say, 20-something years. Yes, poverty takes long to do that. But what China did was, apart from just focusing on their economic growth, they also put in place measures around poverty reduction, okay? They took measures around ensuring access to social services. So for instance, they made compulsory education up to year 9. Apart from that, also they introduced a lot of social protection programs, okay? So some of these in rural areas, some of these in urban areas, to give income support to these households, to give them access to services, to help them engage with the economy. And beyond that also, they increased social insurance types of programs. So people were insured for when they face a shock or when they no longer can access their income. So most people, when they talk about China's success story, they like to focus on the economic part, but we forget that there's a lot of investments in the social part, particularly in social protection. So I think for Nigeria, already we see that the economy is affected by COVID-19. To strengthen it also and to just ensure that there's recovery, I think there's need for a focus both on the social side, particularly around social protection, and also on the economic side. If we do not do that, even if the country continues to grow, this growth will only belong to a few people.
Let's look at those safety, what do you call that, social protection and safety nets that are being put in place by government, and compared to the ones or the situation you mentioned in China. In China, part of what they did, part of social protection is also economic protection. So at the point they shut down their borders, so nothing that is not made in China is brought in or bought within China. In our case, we still have a lot of importation coming in. We still have, besides those safety nets that are being put out, I mean, conditional cash transfer, trader money, all those interventions by government here and there, artisan money. You begin to look at the value of even the currency or the value of the money that you're given to this man to invest in his business, considering the fact that some other amenities like power, road, and water are not available. So how would that help? If you say, no, if you're comparing the situation we have with China, let's break it down a little bit further.
Okay. That is a very interesting question. Thank you. So I think at the end of the day, it's about achieving that balance. So sometimes I think, ideally, most traditional governance systems tend to think that as long as the economy is growing, everybody will access the benefits of economic growth. And on the other side, as you said, the assumption is as long as we're giving these people some form of support, they'll be economically stable. But at the end of the day, what I mentioned in the case of China is balancing those investments. So making sure that the economy continues to grow, that is one thing. Investing in social services, so also economic infrastructure, so access to roads, markets, those are also critical. Because at the end of the day, if those things continue to grow, people are protected from shocks and are also given some form of income protection. They're able to take advantage of what exists in the economy. So my point is to ensure that there's that balance. So we're not just focusing on the economic growth and thinking once the economy grows, everything else becomes okay. And we're not just focusing to say once we provide this particular income support to the poorest, they'll be able to take advantage of what is happening in the economy. So it's making sure that we consider both social development, economic development, social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, as all of them as being necessary to achieving growth for the country, so to achieving overall development of the country. So that is basically what is very key. So sometimes there are decisions on which type. Obviously, government does not have money that just goes on for forever. At the end of the day, they need to prioritize. But in prioritizing this, there's need to understand how one part of the economy or one part of the social side affect each other. So what are those linkages that need to be fostered? What are those things that we should be putting in place to make sure that the economy continues to grow, but as it grows, people are carried along and can also enjoy those benefits of economic growth. So I think that is a very critical point. Getting that balance is not always easy, because sometimes there's a notion to say, as long as the economy continues to grow, eventually everybody will be carried along and eventually everybody will benefit from what is happening. But unless the deliberate efforts are put in place, this is always not the case. And we've seen, I think, with a lot of African countries, including Nigeria, that economies have grown over a long period of time. But in any case, the poverty reduction has been very, very small. So even in Nigeria now, people will tell you a few years ago, we had 58% population poor. We now have like 40.1 thereabouts. But at the end of the day, in the real sense, there's no reduction because we've had population growth. So without growth, it means more people. When we say 40%, that's still more people than that was before that are living in poverty.
I'd like you to connect these dots for me, please, if you don't mind. Nigeria is has one of Africa's largest economies. Nigeria also has probably the largest proportion of poor people. Can you please connect those two for me?
Had a short break, and can you just say that?
Yes. Nigeria has one of the largest economies in Africa. Nigeria has almost the highest percentage of poor people. Can you please connect those two?
It's a very interesting question and point that you've raised. Indeed, as you said, Nigeria is the biggest economy here in Africa, but actually it has the largest number of poor people in the world, okay?
In
so
the
largest
world,
number of
not just in
living
Africa.
in poverty across any world. But despite that, yes, so we are the biggest economy. So I think a key issue there to look at is where exactly is this economy growing, okay? So we find, like is a case with most African countries, it's in the extractive, okay? The extractive industry. But when you ask yourself to say, where do we find a significant number of people? Which sector are these people found in? We find that it's agriculture. So even if we're growing and maybe the oil markets before, of course, the COVID-19 were quite high, there was a lot of money coming in, there's some form of manufacturing, though at a small level, we find that those sectors do not employ the largest number of people, okay? It's the agricultural sector that employs the largest number of people. So a critical issue is where is the growth taking place? Is the growth taking place in the sector that has the most people? That is a very important question. So if we were seeing, for instance, the growth levels that we have in maybe the oil or the gas industry, in the agriculture industry, it means all those people that are involved in that value chain would benefit from the growth. So that's why you see, despite the huge growth that is taking place in the economy or the significant growth, we don't find this trickling down to a large number of people because these people are in the other sector, so the more traditional sector, the agriculture sector. So unless we can invest in a lot of people in that sector and make sure that they can increase productivity, they have access to markets, this will still remain to be a challenge. If you look, for instance,
Sheila, permit me to interrupt you here, Sheila. We will need to go on a quick break. We'll come back and pick it up from this point. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. We still have the Save the Children International Social Protection Specialist, Sheila Nkunika, in our Abuja studio. Sheila, before we went on that break,
she was connecting the dots for us. How come we have the largest economy and yet we have the largest number of poor people?
Yeah, Sheila, can you pick it up from there?
Yes. So as I was saying, you find that most of this economic growth is in the oil industry, so in the gas sectors. But we find most of the poor people are actually in the agricultural sector. So unless those sectors are taken up and there's investment there and value chains are built, we will continue to see this type of characteristic in the country. In fact, when you talk about this particular situation, if you look at the recent LNSS, you find that it says the Gini coefficient, so the inequality measurement is about 35.2, if I'm not mistaken. When you look into the numbers, you actually discover that only 20% of the Nigerian population actually enjoy 40% of all the income in the country, okay? So the remaining 80% of the population have only access to the remaining about 60% of the income. Even worse, the very bottom 20% only have access to 6%, okay? So you can see the top have 40%, the very bottom have 6% of the income. So those disparities, those inequalities are definitely there and are very visible, even when you just look at basically the data. So, and as I said, as long as most of the people are not carried along in the different economic activities that are happening, as long as investments are not being made in agriculture, for instance, where we find the most people, or in very small, medium-sized businesses where most people are struggling, if support is not being provided there, and linkages to markets and other things like that, you find that the economy will continue to look like that. So we have very strong growth, but the number of poor consistently remains high.
Sheila, just before we let you go, let's see this. Someone, D. Tough, sent this in. It says, efforts at eradicating poverty should take place mainly via mindset reset in areas such as best practice governance, living standards enhancement, social investment, order plus security, value creation, continuous skill acquisition, and zero tolerance to corruption and nepotism. Do you agree with DTOF? And how do you think all of this will work?
So definitely, I think those are very good prescriptions and description of things that we need to do. As I said when I began, when you talk about eradicating poverty, it's not one particular system or one particular program that can resolve this. I like that they bring up the mindset, because sometimes poverty, like I said, is multidimensional. So when you think about poverty, it's not just about me as a person having money, okay? It goes beyond that. What is my level of education? What is my level of participation in society? What can I do? And apart from that, that's at an individual level. The issue is around systems. So systems are very important, and I like that that was brought up in this particular contribution. So systems around how do we handle corruption, systems around how do you implement pro-poor programs, how do you implement social investment. So already we see government coming up, for instance, with the National Social Register. So this is a register of all the poor in the country. At the moment, it's still not very widespread. It's being spread out, but that's an opportunity to start something. So from there, we've seen countries like Rwanda, for instance, that has a register that covers everyone. When we are focusing on programs, that helps us to target. And that is some of the work that we do Save the Children. We support, of course, from the FCDO, is really to support those systems to be strengthened. At the end of the day, it's not just about providing cash or providing opportunities. It's also about ensuring there is strong accountability, there's transparency, there's good governance. So I think I like that, that contribution, and I think definitely those are some of the things that we should focus on going forward. Of course, making allocations to financing, but financing is not enough. Even if you have all the money in the world, if you do not have the systems, this will not happen. But even if you have the systems, if these systems are not respected, they're corrupt, and there's no transparency, still your results will be affected. So it's important as we move forward to continue thinking about how those things come together to really support poverty eradication.
Thank you so much, Sheila Nkunika, Senior Special Protection Specialist, Save the Children International, Nigeria. Thank you for sharing this morning with us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion.
Thank you. All right, so we'll be back in a moment. Just stay with us.